So we do have a volunteer coordinator who helps to care for, a number of volunteers to reach out with, talents. So for example, in the past, like we had little like tech gremlins, little bugs that lived in the app. And, sometimes that would crash, or say our website on days that like Indigenous Peoples Day crashed our site. And so they were able to help us along with, partners that we have to step up our technology to make sure that that site won't crash, particularly when people are trying to access that information the most. So folks who are able to lend their skills, expertise, including research skills. Research skills are something that are always like super, super helpful for us to be able to draw on. So if folks are interested in contributing in any way, there is some information on the website itself. I think it's under the contribute tab. But sign up, join our Slack page, and it's just simple enough as like introducing yourself, saying, I'm so-and-so, this is where I'm from, and I have these particular skills. Can I be of use? And it might not be something immediate, depending on what we've got on the go, but eventually, like, we would love to engage with folks as much as possible for particular projects or particular things that we're doing. But again, those particular projects are at the request of community. And then to take it a little bit further, and I haven't mentioned it yet, but kind of ties into all of this, conversation in the last few minutes, but regions of the world that we don't necessarily know. So for example, South and Central America, as well as Africa, they are the areas of the world that we're working on the most to add to the map. But we've hired regional experts who are the ones who are actually leading the research and leading the mapping in those regions. So we're then making sure that it's actually people on the ground who have that knowledge, that intimate knowledge of, even what it means to be Indigenous, who's defined as Indigenous, how is it defined, and all those other intricacies. So we make sure that it is community-based at every possible level. But certainly, anyone with any sort of volunteer skills, anything from like tech to research to grant writing to whatever you got, there's a good chance that we would really love your contribution.
And because it just seems like, I don't know if this is like crass to say, but like talk about money, but like so fundable. I mean, you guys have such an amazing mission to produce something which is so deep, but has been so absent, I guess I would say. Like, what's your relation? Do you guys like approach foundations and things like that? Do you have like, when you sit in your chair as executive director, I know, I've got the CEO role in our team. They're very similar roles where you're sort of like, you're responsible for like making sure that everything is happening properly to a degree, right? Like you don't do all the work, but it's like that kind of like buck stops.
Balls all the time.
Yeah. This is funny. I don't know if this resonates with you at all, but like, as a CEO, it's one of these things, or as an executive director, you kind of take it for granted. It's like, what do I do? Well, I do, I'm like a leader and I like make sure stuff's happening. But I heard somebody say recently that, what does a CEO do? They only do three things. They help come up with the vision and make sure that all stakeholders and team know what it is and are driving in the right direction. You recruit, hire, and retain the best talent to work on the team. And you always make sure there's enough money in the bank. And then everything else you delegate to somebody else. Except that's not really how it works, right? You always have a passion, you get involved in, this, that, or the other thing. But when you think about like, and I don't want to like dote on this, but I just do find it so interesting. Like, are your ambitions to like make this a much bigger organization, like in pursuing like much larger grants or funding partners, or is the pathway more of an organic? I know you have a Patreon too, right? You have a Patreon and then like a funder circle for larger funders. Where's the ambition on that level currently? Like, do you think about it all the time? Like, man, if I can get that $25 million grant, or is the approach, because they can both work, but the approach of more organic, smaller dollars, larger number of people approach?
Yeah, and I think basically, I'm so thankful to be in touch with organizations who support Native nonprofits, particularly through general operating grants. So basically, rather than someone prescribing to us who might be non-Indigenous, though always
Right.
grateful for funding, but rather than having the things that we need to do prescribed to us, that flexibility to be able to say, we need, like, we need funding to do X, Y, and Z so that we can best serve community. So that is absolutely wonderful. But, funding is always in the back of your mind as a nonprofit, right? There's always like making sure that, grants and funding and so on come through. And we are very lucky to have some major supports who, they uplift us in so many ways, not just in funding, but just, wraparound supports and providing spaces for really beautiful conversations to happen. But that being said, the future of Native land, we know that it's a useful and a needed tool. And so sustainable funding is certainly something that is top of mind. And, to be able to get to a point where we're not worrying about, do we know for sure that we have funding to carry on for the next 5 years? That is certainly ultimately the goal, alongside of, growing the organization, making sure there are Indigenous folks working for Native land from across the world and everything else. So, I mean, if someone wants to give us $25 million, heck yeah, we're going to take it. And we're going to do a lot of cool stuff.
In my opinion, you deserve it. I think that, and that's, and I think that you'll find it. It's just so large. I mean, you guys, I don't know if if you ever think about this, you're not doing like a Wikipedia per se, but I feel like the knowledge base that you're building is every bit as important as that. And it's unique, right? Like, this is not going to show up on Wikipedia. Like, you need the levels of governance that you're building, the way that you interface with Indigenous groups, people, communities, to like vet that the information that you provide is like truthful and valued from the people that it applies to the most, is its own necessary mechanism for this kind of work. I just, like, that's, I don't know, it's just in the background of my head. Like, I definitely know that we're going to do whatever we can, which is not always a lot, but just to try to make connections of people to you to get those resources. Because it's already big and great, but it should be even bigger and better, in my opinion, right? And that requires those kind of resources to do.
Something else that I just wanted to mention, we talked before about, when you learn whose land you're on, what do you do next, right? Like, what are those next steps? But I would encourage folks to make sure that once you know whose land you're on, in what ways can you then support that community and support local organizations and so on. So, though we're talking about funding specifically for Native land at this moment, I also want to put it back, just like ways to support communities where you are, where you live and so on, is to make sure that, that their events are financially supported, or that some of their major projects are supported and so on. So yeah, just wanted to kind of stick that in there as well.
No, that's great. And there's two things I'm going to say. I think they're both maybe kind of like large, but I'll say them both at the same time on here. So one, I am interested to the degree that Native land like has like policy positions or not, like things that you want to see happen with Native land. So, for example, you mentioned land back earlier as would you call it like a movement or a thought process, or maybe a set of policy proposals? But like, and I don't know to what degree Native land, get behind like, hey, this is what should happen, right? And I'm naive of all the different policy positions out there. Like, I'll read sometimes like, why not return national parks in the U.S. to Indigenous stewardship, or why not levy a small nationwide property tax on all land and provide that to tribes, or or through land back turn over more land in different ways. So I'm curious, to the degree that you have a position of some of those things that you think should happen, or if it's kind of more hands off and that happens at different levels. And then the other question that I have along those lines is maybe let's do that first. That one's, I feel like that's big enough. I'm curious to hear like what you advocate for on that front.
So the way that we work, because we are global, is if there is any story, if there's any sort of advocacy that needs to be done, we will find a way to amplify Indigenous voices. That's kind of like, the full stop, right? So if there's any way that we can support, or that we can really put messages out into the world to even educate folks on things that they don't often know are happening. So, for example, the creation of wilderness and conservation space is happening in the Congo and Tanzania right now, where Indigenous people are being killed to create these conservation spaces, but no one is talking about it really in North America. But we're able to kind of help to amplify those stories, because we do have those contacts of folks in Africa who are able to, you know, share the stories, share the petitions, so that we can help to push it out and hopefully catch the attention of folks so we can stir things up. So really, you know, as much support as possible for any of those types of, you know, movements or, you know, sharing of knowledge, but particularly with land back, that's an area that we do focus on. But what we know that we need to do next is not only educate folks on what land back is and different times that land back happens, but how can we then make sure that the folks who reach out to us saying, I have land that we want to give back to folks, what do I do? Our answer is often, you know, you need to contact your local community. But, you know, is there, and this is more so me even asking a question, are there organizations that are more regional and so on that help to facilitate that land back or that transaction, I guess would be the call. But yeah, so we're just trying to find ways that we can help. And of course, what those policies are that we support and so on, that's going to change depending on how community needs us to change and what we need to answer to.
That makes a lot of sense. And it reminds me too, because I was reading some of those things you mentioned. You guys run a pretty, like, you post frequently on Instagram and other social media, and you see a lot of the stories that you were talking about, where in addition to the, you know, the mapping of the territory and the access to the resources, you see very active, like, issues and projects and victories and all that stuff kind of coming through on that feed. The other question I'm curious about, because I feel like this is probably on a lot of people's minds who are not, like, Indigenous as kind of categorized in these conversations, and we're kind of like, I'm the settler colonial person in this issue, and I really don't know what I'm talking about at all. So how do I find myself in this map? Any thoughts on, like, how to help people find out, like, how they would, you know, how in a historical context they would trace themselves back to indigenously, like, where am I indigenously from? Right. And this is, like, I feel like I'm a lot of Americans, like, you know, if you kind of ask me, like, where am I from? You know, a big part of, like, American culture, I think, is sort of like intentionally forgetting the past, which has good and bad components to it. Like, if I may, on that, obviously a complicated issue. The good component is, like, the ideal is that everybody moves forward more or less on equal footing, right? So we're moving forward. That's what we're doing. But of course, you know, when you've lost all your roots on stuff and then you get confused about where you're going, there's sort of nothing to turn back around to go, how did I even get here? Right? Like, how did this even happen? Like, I'm like kind of like rudderless. And that's also probably, if I may, another American cultural trait at the moment is, like, I don't even know what we're doing. Yeah. Right? Is this supposed to be getting better? I don't know. Like, I've got all this access to convenience, but I don't know if I'm necessarily happier or more connected to anything. So like, getting to a point in that, I guess, is like, you know, there's ancestry.com. There's, you know, which will help you trace census and family histories. There's, you know, 23andMe's of the world to, like, sequence your DNA. And any thoughts on, like, how, and I guess, like, particularly applying to, like, white people or, like, you know, the European mutts that kind of whose ancestors came across the ocean and we just completely lost the plot. Like, how do you find yourself on native land in that case, right? Is there something where you can see yourself in the map too, in addition to kind of being like, whoa, careful, like, I'm treading somewhere where I wasn't invited? How does that work for people? Or any thoughts on how to make that experience work?
Yeah, there's a lot there, right? Because we exist in a world where settlement has happened, right? When colonization of indigenous territories, it's happened. It is continuing to happen. And so, like, for me, so being Indigenous and mixed settler, I am lucky to know who my family is, the places that they first settled, the implications of their settlement in Algonquin territory, and so on. So knowing that, say, my Polish ancestors came from a particular region of Poland, or, you know, Irish from a particular region of Ireland, and so on, there's there's still a beauty in knowing that, right? Like there's really, it's so much, and it's such a big question, Jerry, that you've asked, because like in Canada, we are dealing a lot with issues of folks who are claiming Indigenous identity that is not necessarily legitimate. So there's a real danger there, and there's a real trauma that it puts onto Indigenous folks, particularly those with legitimate ancestry who are attempting to reconnect. So it's actually causing the further marginalization of Indigenous folks from our own nations. So stay away from that. Full stop. But basically, like when it comes to, 23andMe, or, not necessarily saying them in particular, but just if you're going to do a DNA test, make sure that you know how that data is going to be treated, right? And how it's going to be protected, and who owns that data of like what your DNA actually is. So that's one thing that I'll say. But then also too, being in North America, I like to pretend that North America is the center of the world, though it's not. So if we, like my husband, he's Scottish, but he says, I'm also Canadian. That's great, but you're also still Scottish. You still have those roots that you can trace back, right? So if you're able to, in whatever way possible, make sure that you are proud, or you can be proud of who you are, what your lineage is. And though we look a lot to like Indigenous identities and so on, it's such a big topic right now about like reconnecting and who Indigenous folks are. Like there's a real resurgence of telling Indigenous stories that oftentimes they do get appropriated and so on. That's one side. But then the other side is that there's often massive colonial guilt that's associated, which then turns into things like hesitancy in, reaching out or changing or whatever it might be. But that guilt isn't necessarily something that's going to be effective, right? That's not necessarily a good place for you to sit as an individual, knowing that your ancestors were folks who came and settled here. I don't think Indigenous folks, I don't speak for anyone else other than myself, but I don't think that many Indigenous folks are asking for settlers to feel guilty about who they are, but rather be conscious of who you are when you're on Indigenous territories, which is pretty much everywhere in the world. But there's also a responsibility to learn and reconnect and know those histories. And I think, and I've heard a lot of elders and knowledge keepers talking about this in recent years, is that perhaps North Americans are feeling fairly untethered and unrooted. And that's perhaps where a lot of our discontentment comes from, right? And a lot of that fixation on like ownership and being the best and like having the most amount of money and whatever it is. But what if we boil it down again, figure out where it is that we come from, what our connection is to land, figure out how to be in good relation with the places that we are now, act as stewards, because these are now our homes wherever we might be. So yeah, there's so much to it, and knowing that, we've only got so long to chat, but that's kind of a bit of a snapshot.
Well, I know, and I do like, just to sort of like begin to wind things down and land this airplane on stuff. So, so the way that I first learned about Native Land Digital was actually a very pleasant surprise that our co-founder and chief technology officer, Larry, when we did a site update for Regrid, this is going back to like 2019, I here, let me refresh the page. Okay, everything's looking good. Click on a property to see the current information about like owner and taxes and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, what is this? There's a new category of information here. I'm like, okay, so this is the tribal, this is the land that I'm on. Oh my God, like where did this come from? And he's like, oh, there's this great site, great service, Native Land, and they have an API where we can just kind of plug this in. So like when you're looking up, present day land and real estate information, colonial land and real estate information, you can at least get this little ping of like, hey, like, by the way, like click this link and maybe get an understanding of who and what was here prior to this having a rectangle drawn around it, right? And again, a small thing, but very enlightening. And I being in this sort of like land data, real estate data world, which so many different businesses, so many different sectors of the economy rely on, I'll tell you, people are very interested in getting as much historical real estate data as possible to provide, but I've never seen a land data provider ever even like acknowledge that there's a land history prior to the the Jefferson grid of like subdivided, square miles and smaller property sections. And something that I would, I guess maybe suggest, and that I would be happy to help personally kind of work on with this, is since we do exist in that industry and we've kind of put at least a toe into that water, I do think there's an opportunity for native land to interface with large real estate data companies, including some of the popular services like a Zillow or a Redfin or a Trulia, to have a conversation about potentially integrating some of this data for a larger audience. Again, I get it. Like, they're going to be so focused on their business, practices. There's a hesitancy to like, why would I add like another thing that could be distracting on it? But it does feel like there's like a vector for distributing your work and raising funds that could run through. I don't know if he likes or doesn't like this idea, but that's somewhere in there. But just pointing out, it kind of feels like you could approach some of these organizations and businesses and say, hey, look, you're dealing in information about the land and real estate. That's great. We get it. Like, people need this and want this. Here's an additional lens, which is deeper, that actually your audience might even appreciate if at a minimum they find it interesting. They've never seen it before. That could reach a lot of people. And so if that's something that you'd be interested in picking up like later on, I could almost see like something that people start to like, as part of like their governance, start to just like have associated with their data sets that like we recognize. It's almost like, God, this is a weird way to put it. I'm kind of putting this together in my brain for the first time, but it's almost like this digital land acknowledgement when people are providing real estate information, that there's this world that this rests on, that you should probably pay attention to too. So I just share this as an idea, because I see that from just my own lens in this kind of like business world and industry, that could have some legs if that was of interest. But.
Yeah, and I think I would say every industry, every person who is living on or visiting land has that responsibility to know that this is still Indigenous territory wherever you are. And so any way possible to help to share that information so that it's like kind of, the more that it's in front of you, the more that it will remain top of mind, ultimately leading to more care for land itself, right? Like we do have that responsibility. So, I mean, certainly, and that's the beauty of being an open source platform, is that data is able to be applied anywhere that folks are willing to put it.
Well, so you could make it easier. I mean, honestly, I know you'll keep enriching it, but it really is easy to use for those who are listening and thinking about it, right? It's a bit of like set it and forget it, and then it's there. Set it and forget it in a good way, right? You want to remember it, but like forget it on the implementation part, where it's like it's flowing in. Okay, good, right? Now it's there.
Yeah, I mean, oddly enough, I'm not a tech person, even though I work for a tech organization, but I have been told that it is quite easy to work with. And so, there are a few things to consider, though, when you are integrating, is that any use of the API data needs to be used ethically and responsibly. If folks are able to contribute back to native land for the use of that data, we appreciate it. Every little bit counts. But then also too, because we do so many additions and corrections, right, and updates, as long as the platform's able to continue kind of talking to ours, and so that any updates get integrated in, those are pretty much the only kind of touch points that we ask for.
Yep. No, which is great. And again, for the funding part, you have both a Patreon, and we'll link to that on this too, and then also the funders circle. Is that the right terminology for that?
Yeah. We've got a Patreon account. We take direct donations, whether monthly or one-time donations, through PayPal. Also, any just individual donations can contact us directly. And then we do have a supporter circle set up for folks who, would use the data often. So thinking like academic institution or other kind of corporate businesses, just to kind of show that appreciation back for the, providing that information, and then further just helping the organization to survive and employ wonderful Indigenous folks from around the world.
Yep. And that's where the Regrid team is it's the supporter circle for that. So that's like, and we'll make sure that we link all this stuff out for everybody too, because it's easy to do and it's important. And I think a lot of people will see the value. I hope we help find a few more on that front. And I guess, I know you've got to physically travel here shortly. So just to kind of like wind us down, any other, shout outs or things that you want people to know that we should include along with sharing this when we publish it, or anything else, just to make sure that the fullest picture with the proper attributions was shared here?
Yeah, I just think like overall, you know, individually learning more, right? Whatever that learning journey is going to take, know that, you know, as you start to learn more about Indigenous peoples, Indigenous territories, and so on, you're not going to learn everything within the course of, you know, even a year or something like that. I've been, you know, learning about this for over 30 years, and I look forward to the next 30 or so more. Hopefully there's not many more, but know that like any little bit is incredibly significant, just in being good relations to each other, learning about what that longer history actually looks like, and then supporting Indigenous folks, whatever they might be doing, like anything from Indigenous film to Indigenous authors to land back to being on land, to the way that you behave when you are on land, right? Like just anything little is actually very significant. Okay.
And on that note, I hope that we get to continue this, you know, relationship, and that, you know, that this continues into the future. But we'll be watching you guys and using your maps and linking to them and doing whatever we can to support. So Christine, I appreciate you taking the time to catch up with us today.
Absolutely. Chimigwich, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thanks, Christine. All right. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye. Bye.